us is being given by our best speaker from last year, Dr. Doroski, PhD. He's Associate Professor at the University of Steubenville, and his talk, which you can probably see, is When Does Human Life Begin? Fertilization is not a good enough answer. I'm going to read a little bit of his background. One thing I can tell you about his background is that he looks too young to have a PhD. I think I would say the same thing about Katrina, too. But anyway, Dr. Doroski received his doctorate in biomedical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and currently teaches developmental anatomy and human embryology at Franciscan University. He's a regular speaker on in vitro fertilization, stem cells, and other bioethical topics. Dr. Doroski has presented his work exploring how to understand when organisms begin in light of the biological data at the University of Buffalo's Romanell Center for Bioethics and Philosophy of Medicine Conference. He's also published an analysis of how pro-life approaches have advanced reproductive health care in the Lineker Quarterly, and as a manuscript on the dominance of adult stem cells in clinical trials that is currently under review. That's basically what you talked about last year, right? Okay, in addition to his bioethical work, Dr. Doroski does experimental research that is focused on stem cells and tissue engineering. This work has been published in scientific journals such as Biomaterials, Tissue Engineering, and PLOS 1. So we actually scheduled him for an hour. He was planning to do a little longer presentation, so let's see how that goes.
Okay, if I can, I'd like to not use the mic. Is this okay? Can I just talk like this? All right, so again, I'm Dr. Derek M. Doroski. A lot of you met me before, and I was going to give a little other introduction. I like to give fun facts about myself at the beginning of my talks. I was going to give a new one this time, but I'm actually going to do the same one as last year, so apologies to those of you who already heard this, because this one's a little shorter than the one I was going to do, and maybe this will get us close to on time. Okay, so anyway, if you look at my name, it's Derek M. Doroski, all right? And if you look at this Doroski, that means ski. That means that I'm Polish, right? Okay? So now if you look at me and you say, wow, really? All right, that makes sense. Because I'm not 100% Polish. I'm actually only partly Polish. My dad's German Polish, maybe that doesn't help. And my mom is Filipino, so I'm a German Filipino. Okay. So anyway, that's me, Dr. Derek M. Doroski. Now, the topic I want to look at today is kind of very related to when, or it basically is a topic about when does human life begin. And I've been looking at this topic because I've been involved in pro-life work for a long time now. And one thing I've seen is that very commonly pro-lifers, I think, rightly focus on when does human life begin, and then when they try to provide an explanation, they say human life begins at fertilization, because that's when you have this new, unique human chromosomal constitution. Well, I've noticed over the years that there are a lot of problems with saying that. Okay, so what I want to do, what I've actually been working on for a while, is figuring out what would be better? What's a better way of looking at this? What actually is a better explanation here? Because I want to be able to have this explanation ready so that when pro-choicers finally stop being scared of even asking this question of when human life begins, we have an answer that's ready to meet any challenges that they might bring to us. So as Dr. Doroski already mentioned, I did already, so this is work that I'm working on right now. I've got actually 2 papers I'm planning on writing on this. I'm working with a graduate student in philosophy at Franciscan University, where I work right now on this, but I have already presented it at a Philosophy of Bioethics and Medicine conference at State University of New York at Buffalo. Okay, it was actually very well received there. All right, so I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a very new set of ideas that maybe you won't see anywhere else, so take it critically, all right? Maybe I don't have it down completely correctly, all right? If you see an issue in it, then let me know so I can make this even better, All right, but let's take a look at this. Now, let's say that we were trying to figure out when does human life begin? How would we figure that out? All right, there are a lot of approaches that you might take, but I think one approach you might take is you might say, well, I don't know when it is, and I don't know how to figure it out, so let me go to someone who does know. Okay? So then you ask yourself, well, who does know? Well, okay, there are a lot of things you could call me, but I'd say at least one thing is I'm in biology, so I'm kind of a biologist. So I kind of want to go to biologists and say, what does the science say about this? But biologists study life. But then you say, well, which biologist should we go to? All right, we're not going to go to ornithologists, all right? People who study birds, they're not going to be the ones who's going to tell us when does human beings begin. If we want to know anything about birds, we go to them. So you might think, well, maybe we go to OBGYNs, all right? They can tell us when human life begins, all right? Because they deal with births and the pregnancy and everything. Now, I actually think that might be a little bit better, but I don't think that they're the best people to go to, because OBGYNs, they don't actually study human development and when do organisms begin and that kind of thing. They try to figure out what can we do to ensure the best health outcomes for, say, the mother. So they actually ask different questions. They're really close to that area, but not exactly there. Who is it that actually studies when organisms begin? Well, that's developmental biologists. So I think that's the group that we would really want to go to as our first approximation. So let's ask some developmental biologists. That's something I actually teach. But the question is, who do you ask? Well, maybe you do a poll of them. Well, I haven't seen any polls. I haven't seen any data on developmental biologists' opinions on this question. So, okay, we can't do that. Well, what could we do? All right, well, we could we want to find some source that's fairly authoritative in this area. So what we could do is we could go to a developmental biology textbook. So that's what I did. And you could say, well, which one did you go to? There are a lot of them. Well, the answer is, I went to all of them. Okay? So let's take a look at them. All right, we're not going to look at all of them, but a couple of, okay, one more thing. Got this. Dr. Dodd, I have underneath that blue book in the back, there's a folder. Okay, in the folder I have this handout. Could you, or maybe one of the students, could you pass that handout? So this has kind of a summary of my talk. So if you look on that handout, one thing that I have is I have all these quotations, if you want them, plus the citation of them in the footnotes. Okay, so you can have all of those. All right, thank you so much for the help. Okay, so let's look at this one, for instance, from Before We Were Born, Essentials of Embryology and Birth Defects, kind of a pretty popular textbook in medical schools. Okay, so if you go to page 327, there's an interesting quotation. They say, there are different opinions of when an embryo becomes a human being whose opinions are often affected by religious and personal views. Okay, good. The scientific answer. So what do they say is the scientific answer? The scientific answer is that the embryo is a human being from the time of fertilization. Okay, so they're saying human beings begin at fertilization. Why? Because of its human chromosomal constitution. Okay, so they're saying we begin at fertilization, it's because of our human chromosomal constitution. Okay, so that's one thought right there. If you go to this one, Developmental Biology by Gilbert Scott, this is probably the most popular book in developmental biology. Okay, on page 109, it says fertilization, beginning a new organism. So he seems to say fertilization. If you go to Shirley Wright, she has a nice kind of atlas of developmental biology. On page 53, she says, fertilization is the defining process of sexual reproduction where a new individual with a unique genetic constitution is produced. Okay, so she's saying it's fertilization also. Okay, we look at this one, fertilization, this one, fertilization, this one, fertilization, this one says fertilization, this one says fertilization, they all say fertilization. Okay, so I got every single developmental biology textbook that is currently in use, and I looked at them all. Every single one says new organisms begin at fertilization. They're unanimous. Okay, I couldn't find any textbook actually of any kind that said something else. So there are a couple questions where you can say, let's say we do believe it's fertilization. All right, I think there are some problems with that, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so let's say we do think it's fertilization. Well, why is it fertilization? Well, most of them, interestingly, don't have an explanation. If they do explain it, they say it's due to this chromosomal content, which I will suggest, I'll show later why there are problems with that. So what I say, though, is I think this is a good first approximation, because what this tells us is what's kind of the biological consensus, what are, at the very least, the intuitions of all of the people who study when things develop. In fact, if you go over 100 years ago, developmental biologists were already saying that organisms begin at fertilization. Okay, so this is not a new discovery at all right? And it tells you a lot about the intuitions. Now, what I'd say is that I think that this is a great place to start, and kind of from a practical pro-life perspective, what I would suggest is if you're just dialoguing with someone, this is what I lead with. I lead with if you want to talk about when human life begins, every single developmental biology textbook says that it's fertilization. Now, if the person finds that acceptable, I think a lot of people get convinced just right there, then you can stop. Now, if they start bringing up problems with this idea, then you have to go further, all right? And that's why I'm here to help with that, okay? Okay, so this kind of tells us some things. It tells us kind of this major biological intuition of developmental biologists. Now, I think we could stop there, but we don't want to because we want to know why. And now, if we have a different explanation, though, what I'd say is that you have to have a really good reason why all the developmental biologists are wrong or maybe slightly off, all right? You have to have some explanation of what is it that they've been recognizing here. Why does every single one seem to think that it's fertilization, okay? So I'll try to give you some aspects of that here at least. Okay, so anyway, that's the biological consensus. Now, let's say we want to look for why this is and look at kind of a set of criteria that would be even better, all right? So you start to make up your own set of criteria, but I think before you do that, what you really need to do is you have to ask yourself, what would a good set of criteria be able to do? What would make something a good set of criteria? Well, what I propose is that a good set of criteria would be able to answer a lot of different cases. In fact, all the cases. So really what you should be asking is not when do human beings or human organisms begin, but when do all organisms begin, okay? So here's kind of how I would map that out. All right, there may be other ways to do this, but I think there are at least 4 different types of cases you have to be able to explain. And I'll go over each of these. So standard cases, unusual cases, non-organismal cases, and controversial cases. And you want to be able to explain all of these, all right? I could give a whole hour talk on this. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, just some highlights of this, okay? In fact, one of my papers is just going to be on this. So let's start with standard cases. Let's say that you say, okay, Dr. Dorosky, you have not explained what is the problem with saying human life begins at fertilization. Well, one of the problems is that if you look at all the developmental biology textbooks, they don't say fertilization is an instant. They talk about the process of fertilization, a 12-hour process. So even if you know human life begins at fertilization, when is it? Well, you might say, well, it's when you have that new human chromosomal constitution. Well, that's a problem too. Let me explain that. Okay, so beginning of fertilization, you have the sperm, you have the egg, they come together, they fuse. What do you have then? Well, you have this sperm. So in human beings, you have this one sperm that has one chromosome, all right? One set of chromosomes, that is. Then you have this egg that has one set of chromosomes, but all the chromosomes are copied. So there are 2 amounts of DNA in the egg. So when they fuse together, you actually have 2 chromosomes, but there are 3 amounts of DNA. So 3 amounts of DNA is more than is in a normal cell in your body. Is that really when you began? Maybe, maybe not, all right? Now what happens about 30 minutes later is the egg, or the fertilized egg at this point, gets rid of one of the copies of chromosomes. So now for the first time you have 2 amounts of DNA 30 minutes after the cells have fused. So maybe that's when human life begins, when you have this right amount. But the problem is that in our cells of our body, we don't just have DNA, we have DNA organized in a certain way. The DNA from the oocyte is organized fairly normally. The DNA from the sperm, though, had to be very compacted to fit in the sperm, so it's still compacted, all right? It's not until 6 hours after these cells have fused that DNA unpacks itself. And now you have DNA from the sperm and the egg, both structured normally and the right amount. Maybe that's when human beings begin. But then again, wait a second, you have the right DNA, you have the right amount, it's structured properly, but you haven't used it all. All right, if I just injected DNA into your body, does that make a new human being? Because now there's a unique set of DNA in you? No. All right, maybe you actually have to use that DNA for it to be a new human being. Well, it's not until 8 hours after these cells fuse that both DNA codes are actually used. So maybe that's when human life begins. But we have still more problems because, okay, so then the process of fertilization is done after 12 hours, but then what happens is you have 2 amounts of DNA, they're structured properly and they're both being used, but they're not in one nucleus. So in our cells, all the DNA is in one nucleus. Well, the sperm came in, it had its own sperm nucleus. The oocyte was there, it had its oocyte nucleus. This DNA is in 2 different nuclei. It won't, they're actually called pronuclei at this point. It won't, the DNA won't be all gathered together, structured normally with the right amount all being used until the cell divides 24 hours after fusion, gets to the 2-cell stage. Now, for the first time, you have 2 amounts of DNA in a nucleus, structured normally, all being used. Maybe that's when human life begins. All right, that would actually be after fertilization. So even if you specify fertilization, you say chromosomal content, you still haven't answered a lot of questions that we would really want to answer here. So this is what I call kind of a standard case. You gotta have a good explanation for where in normal development we begin. All right, another type of standard case. So biologists don't just study human beings, they study all living things. So if your criteria only applies to human beings and can't apply to all living things, it's not that good of a criteria. The more organisms it can apply to, the better. So this is a problem with certain criteria, like if somebody proposes human beings begin at implantation, or human beings begin at birth. Well, maybe that makes sense in some sense, but it doesn't make a lot of sense biologically. Let me give you an example of this, okay? So chickens, all right? Chickens, there's this egg that's laying, and the chicken develops in this egg. There's no placenta, so there's never ever any implantation in chickens. So if human life begins at implantation, then when do chickens begin? Is it fertilization? If it is, then why isn't it fertilization in human beings? All right? If it's implantation in human beings, but fertilization in chickens, well, it seems like we're kind of just making up things as we go along. All right? If we want a good biological definition, we want something that applies across many organisms. All right? Let me actually give you an example of this before I get to the next one. Let's say, so there's this event in our development called gastrulation, where we have these 2 layers, and one of the layers kind of moves cells around and then creates 3 different layers of tissues. And each tissue is going to form different things in our body. Now, this is a process called gastrulation. It looks a certain way in human beings, looks differently in frogs, looks different in starfish. Let's just say we took the way it looks in frogs and said, this is what gastrulation is. Well, then we just have to make up new things for what's happening in human beings. Well, what biologists do is they don't look at what's different across these organisms. They look, what's the same in all these organisms? In every single case of gastrulation, you have this movement of cells that creates different germ layers. So what gastrulation is not, it's not what it looks like in a frog. It's the movement of cells that creates 3 different germ layers. And that's how you know when gastrulation is happening. We would want some similar thing with human beings for when they begin. If we want to biologically say, when do human beings begin? Okay, so again, this is, if we apply this to bird, this is a problem because some organisms aren't born, all right? So fish, a lot of fish, for instance, the way that they reproduce is the female fish will deposit all of these eggs into the water, let's say the ocean, all right? And then the male fish deposits sperm into the water, and then it fertilizes the eggs inside of the ocean, all right? So then what's going on? Well, there's no birth process there. So if birth is when human beings or organisms begin, then that means that there are never any new fish. All right? Well, I think there are new fish. And if there are, then it must be something other than birth. All right? Is it fertilization? That seems pretty plausible. If it's fertilization in fish, why isn't it fertilization in humans? Another area that we get problems with this is some people will say human beings begin once they reach a certain cognitive level of development, because these cognitive levels of development are kind of what make us distinctively human. All right? I actually think that this gets it wrong. It's completely backwards because we shouldn't be looking for the things that make us distinctively human to figure out when we begin. We should be looking for the similarities that we have with other organisms if we want a good criteria of when we begin. So if we say, oh, human beings begin with a certain level of rational thought because that makes us distinctively human, well then when do chickens begin? When you have distinctively chicken features? Is that the beak? What is that? All right, when do crocodiles begin? When you have distinctively crocodile features, a snout, a scales, what is that? All right, it starts to look really arbitrary, okay? So you need something that applies to multiple species. That's kind of my second type of standard case. Okay, so that's one thing you have to explain. Another thing you have to explain is unusual cases. One category of this would be identical DNA offspring. So, for instance, let's say we do a cloning procedure. All right, if you do the cloning procedure, the parent the parent and the offspring have identical or nearly identical DNA. Some actually, most of the time, if you do cloning, the DNA won't be exactly the same, but you could do it in such a way that it'd be exactly the same. Okay, I could give a whole other thing about that. All right. So anyway, but in cloning, the offspring have DNA that's maybe identical to the parent. If you need a new, unique human chromosomal constitution, that means if we actually created a clone, we'd have to say, oh, you're not human, or even if it clearly was. All right. Another example of this that we see in nature, kind of, is the silver salamander. So in the silver salamander, what happens is the male deposits sperm or releases sperm that then fertilize the egg. But it turns out that the egg has all the DNA. The sperm has no DNA. All the sperm does is it starts the egg's development. So if that's the case, well, in the silver salamander, the new salamanders actually come about with no new DNA. So if you need a new kind of chromosomal constitution in order to be a new organism, then where do you get new silver salamanders? All right, it would seem that you actually don't need new chromosome constitution. Okay, so this is a big problem, again, for the chromosomal constitution ideas. All right, another thing you have to explain is non-organismal cases. So there are a lot of times where you have something that's not an organism that seems to meet the criteria that someone lays out for what an organism is. All right, so a lot of textbooks will say, oh, in order to have life, you have to have features like responding to stimuli, digestion, hierarchical organization, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I can explain why all cities do all these things. Okay, cities respond to stimuli. All right, cities maintain borders, which a lot of textbooks will say organisms do. All right, so yeah, cities respond to stimuli. If there's some crime there, then maybe they'll increase the budget for the police. All right, so they respond to stimuli. They digest, if nothing else, because they have people in them, and the people are digesting. They excrete. Well, the people in them are excreting. Plus, cities create trash and then get rid of that. So they excrete. They have a hierarchical organization. Maybe there's a mayor, then he has different departments, and then those departments have different subdivisions. So there's a hierarchy in there. They could even reproduce. Or you could have people from a city leaving the city and then going to make a new city. So I think that criteria that would make cities an organism, where cities fit that criteria, they're not that good criteria. I could do the same thing for dance crews, actually. I could say, like, this dance crew is like, this 5 people all together is an organism if you follow these criteria. Okay, so last type of case that you have to be able to explain is controversial cases. So the example I'll give here is monozygotic, also known as identical twinning. So what happens with identical twins? A couple different ways this can happen. Let me just give you one way, keep it simple. So the sperm fertilizes the egg, all right? Then what happens is we get to the cell divides, we get to the 2-cell stage. So we have the 2-cell embryo here. And one thing that can happen is sometimes these cells kind of get a little far apart from each other, and then what we end up with is 2 new organisms that came from the original 1 fertilized egg, the 1 original zygote. Now, what is happening here? There's actually a lot of controversy. There's controversy within philosophical circles as to what exactly is happening here. One possibility is this, okay? So you get fertilization, and at fertilization, so let's say you say fertilization is when all human beings begin. Then you have to say, in this scenario, at fertilization, you're eventually going to get 2 organisms, so you must start with 2, all right? So let's say that, okay, fertilization, magically, you get 2 organisms. All right, we'll call them Fred and George. So Fred and George are basically conjoined twins. They're both present at that time. And then when the cells separate, essentially what happens is just their bodies are physically separated. But they were always there from the beginning. So that's one possibility. Now, this is one that it's not many people believe this. There are some philosophers that believe this. Actually, I wrote a paper with a philosopher who believes that this is what occurs. I don't think this is what happens, though. Case number 2 could be this. All right, so it could be that at fertilization you have this organism, and then what happens is when this organism's cells kind of separate and we get these 2 organisms, well, the first organism dies, and then we get 2 new ones. So at fertilization, for example, we could have Harry, and then when the cells come apart, Harry actually dies, and now you get Fred and George. All right, so that's another possibility. There are a lot of philosophers who believe this is what's happening with twinning. A third possibility is this. So some philosophers will say, well, an adult can't split into 2 people, all right? So that just doesn't seem like something that human beings can do. So as long as twinning can occur, you can't have had an organism. So what they would propose is that at fertilization you have something that's not an organism, a non-organismal entity. We'll call it dirt, okay? So you start out with dirt, then when dirt separates and moves into two piles and twins, then from dirt, magically, we get Fred and George, all right? So this is another metaphysical possibility, and this is probably the dominant theory among philosophers. All right, it's probably this one that's the most commonly believed. A fourth theory, actually almost no philosopher seem to even know about this possibility, but another possibility is this, that at fertilization we had Fred, all right, one organism, and then what happened is when these cells separate, well, one of those cells is still Fred, so we still have Fred, but then the other cell basically is another organism that budded off of Fred, okay, so basically George buds off of Fred, all right? So this would follow from the developmental biological principle of regulative development, and this appears to be most consistent with what it appears kind of to be what most biologists seem to believe is happening. This is what I think is happening. All right. But anyway, there's a controversial case here. A good set of criteria would be able to explain why certain of these cases are impossible, or if all of them are possible, the criteria would be able to explain in every single case when you're getting a new organism and when you're not. All right? Let's say some of these are possible and some of them are not. A good criteria might be able to say, propose, or kind of, in a sense, suggest experiments that could be done to kind of mitigate which one of these possibilities, how we could figure out which of these possibilities are actually going on. Okay? All right. So those are some things we want to explain. Now, how do we explain it? All right, this is where we get to what my criteria is. So my criteria actually has a hierarchy. Here's kind of the map of my criteria. First, we have this kind of module that says, is there a new organism? All right, we have to ask some questions for that. I'll get into those. Now, in order to answer this question, we have to answer questions about, like, what is an organism? And in order to ask what's an organism, we have to ask, is this thing integrated? All right, so we actually have a set of questions that then feeds into another set, that feeds into another set. So I actually have this hierarchy of criteria that kind of explains all of these different things. So let's start with the first one. Is there a new organism? So on your sheets, I basically have tables. I also have flow charts. And you can kind of use either of them. Let's start with the table. So what I propose you have to do is, let's say you think that there's an event that creates a new organism. What you do is first you say, before that, was there an organism? And then after that, is there an organism? Okay? So let's break down a couple of these. Let's take fertilization. So before fertilization, we don't have an organism. After fertilization, we do have an organism. So guess what? It had to have created an organism. All right? Or you know, at least an organism had to have come into existence somewhere in the period between those two things. All right? So you had a new organism created. Now, what else could happen? Well, you could, let's say you had an organism before, but not an organism after. So let's say there was me, and I take a walk outside, and a huge meteor comes in and incinerates me. All right? So before the meteor strike, there was an organism, me. After the meteor strike, there was not an organism. So what happened? Well, an organism died, sadly. All right. Now, what if you didn't have an organism before or after? So let's take this computer right here. Okay, so this is computer, I go, BAM! Okay, so we say, did BAM do anything? All right, so before I did BAM, there was no organism. It's a computer. All right, after I did BAM, there was no organism. It's still a computer. So guess what? BAM didn't do anything. There was never an organism there. All right? Now, what if we had an organism before and after? So an example of that is these 20 cases. So here, we have Fred before, and afterwards we have Fred and George. So we have an organism before, and we actually have multiple organisms after. So what do we do then? Well, then we actually have to add a third set of criteria, or a third criterion, kind of continuity criterion. If you're more philosophically inclined, you might call this an identity criterion. Basically, it's the sameness idea. Like, is this the same thing before and after? So if we say go down this road, we can say, okay, Fred, is Fred the same as Fred? Yeah, Fred's the same as Fred. All right, so there's continuity there. Therefore, what do we have? Well, it's the same organism as before. Now, what about this one? George. Is George the same as Fred? No, George is different from Fred. So therefore, since George is different from Fred, we don't have continuity. So that means that over here, we actually created a new organism. all right? Okay, so we have all of this, but then we have a problem. All right, let's say that this is completely true. I'm really confident in this level of criteria, all right? Not 100%, but I'm like 95 on this one right now, all right? I think actually there are some additions that could be made to make it even better, but I think this is pretty good. You can tell me all the ways I'm wrong. I would appreciate it, because then I can make it better. All right, so we have a couple problems though. How do we know whether we have an organism? And how do we know whether we have continuity? I don't have answers to continuity. All right, there's a lot of philosophical kind of writing on continuity issues, so I don't have answers to that, but I do have answers to the organism question. So let's ask, how do we know whether we have an organism? Again, I have a chart here, so I propose we have to ask two questions. We have to ask, is it integrated at this level, and is there a higher level of integration? So there are actually a lot of ways you could say this, potentially. Basically, I'm trying to say, like, do you have something that kind of goes up to here and then doesn't go any farther? Like, do you have something that's like one thing and isn't just a part of something else? Do you have something, if you like Aristotelian metaphysics, do you have something that has like a form, like a complete form, or is it just part of a bigger form? All right. Do you have something that's a substance, or is it a subsubstance? Okay, there are a lot of potential ways you could ask this. I like to ask it in this way. Do you have something that's integrated at this level, and does it have a higher level of integration? So let's start with this. Me, okay? I'm integrated at the level of me. I'm not integrated into anything higher. So therefore, I kind of go up this far, so I'm an organism. Now, what about other things? So let's say you have, you had something that is not integrated at this level, and it's not integrated into anything higher. So let's, hold on, I'm gonna cheat real quick. I had some notes here, but I can only see them on my, okay, so there we go. So let's say, yeah, so let's say a city, okay? So a city is not integrated at the level of the city. There's what I'd suggest, so I have to explain integration, and in a moment I will, but a city is coordinated but not integrated. So at the level of the city, it's, oh yeah, so a city isn't integrated at that level, all right? A city also isn't integrated at any higher level. So what is it? It's just multiple different entities. So a city is composed of multiple things. All right, some of them might be organisms, some of them maybe none of them are. Okay, what if you have something that's integrated at a certain level and it's integrated at a higher level? Okay, so what would be an example of that? An example of this would be like your cardiovascular system, your heart and blood vessels. So your heart and blood vessels work together to achieve a goal. All right, so they're integrated at the level of the cardiovascular system. But the cardiovascular system is integrated at a higher level with your endocrine system and your nervous system and all the other systems of your body. So it's actually integrated at this higher level. That means that your cardiovascular system is not an organism, it's part of a larger whole. Perhaps even an organism. It is. All right. What if you have something that's not integrated at its own level, but it is integrated at a higher level? So an example of this would be like your heart, your lungs, and your intestines. Okay, your small intestines. So your heart, lungs, and small intestines aren't really a thing. They're not really directly integrated with each other. So they're not really integrated at the level of just those three things. But they are integrated at a higher level. Your intestines are integrated into your digestive system, your heart's integrated into your cardiovascular system, and your lungs are integrated into your respiratory system, and then all of that together is integrated into you. So at a higher level of organization, they're actually all integrated, just not at that level. So what does that tell you? Well, they're actually multiple pieces of a larger whole. Okay? So you can actually distinguish a number of different things by looking at the integration you have. Now, we can ask, what is integration though? Okay, so, well, again, here we figure out whether it's an organism through integration and feed it in. Now, what's integration? So this is where this is kind of my level 3 criteria. This is where I get less certain, okay? I think in order to figure out whether something's integrated, you have to figure out, does it have interdependent parts, and are those parts subordinate to the whole thing? So all of my parts are interdependent. They depend on each other, and they're subordinate to me. Another way of saying this is that all of my parts, they can have goals, perhaps, but their goals are never different than my own goals. Their goals are just the goals of me, all right? So because they have interdependent parts and they're subordinate to me as a whole, they're integrated, all right? Now, what if we had interdependent parts, but they're not subordinate to a whole? So an example of this would, again, be a city. A city has parts that depend on each other, in order to achieve the goals they're trying to achieve, but the pieces are not subordinate. And when I say subordinate, I mean completely subordinate to the whole. So for instance, I'm a part of a city of Steubenville, Ohio, and sometimes we share the same goals. But Steubenville, Ohio has some goals that I don't have, like paying the workers of Steubenville. I'm okay if they pay the workers, but like that's not my goal. I'm not trying to make sure that they get paid. And I have goals that are different than the city of Steubenville, like feeding my kids. All right, Steubenville would be happy if I fed my kids, but it's not trying to make sure that my kids are fed each night, or that they get songs sung to them, or that they get hugs. All right, the city of Steubenville is not trying to do that. So we have different goals from each other. We have a lot of overlapping goals, so that means we coordinate and we cooperate, but we're not integrated together. Now, what if you don't have interdependent parts, but the parts are subordinate to the whole? So an example of that would be me and this computer. All right, so we're not really interdependent. The computer is kind of dependent on me for its goals, or on whoever it is for its goals. I'm not really dependent on this computer necessarily, like I could just get another computer or something like that, so we're not really strictly interdependent, I don't think. But the me computer whole, completely subordinate to me. All right, if I tell this computer, go ahead one, it's gonna go ahead. All right, it basically follows my instructions. So what does that mean? That means that you have this separate entity that's being completely controlled by another entity. I have this computer that's being controlled by me, all right, because we're not interdependent. Now what if you have something that's not interdependent and not subordinate to the whole? So an example of this would be like bears, beets, and buffalo, all right? A lot of things you could choose, like, I don't know, battleships or something like that, Battlestar, I don't know, but bears, beets, and buffaloes, all right? So bears, beets, and buffaloes, are they interdependent? Well, no, like they have nothing to do with each other. Is the bear, beet, buffalo composite subordinate to the whole bear, beet, buffalo entity? Well, it's not even really an entity, like it's not like a thing. So what is that? It's just actually multiple different entities, all right? So you can actually separate a lot of different categories using this criteria. So if we put all this together, all right, we figure out, is there integration? Is it integrated this higher? That tells us whether we have an organism, and then that tells us these pieces to figure out whether we have a new organism. Now, how would we apply this to human beings, all right? Or actually, one thing I want to note about this, I didn't even plan for this when I first created, I would say almost discovered this criteria. I was really trying to figure this out. But this actually gives you kind of a map that can, it looks to me, that can tell you why certain types of criteria are really kind of attractive, but also what their flaws are. So for instance, the idea that we begin at implantation and birth. Why is that attractive? Because it tells you after implantation and after birth, you have an organism. But what are its flaws? Well, it doesn't tell you whether you have an organism before that. If you do, well then it doesn't create a new organism, you just had the same organism, and if there's continuity, then you just had the same organism before. It doesn't even try to answer what an organism is or whether it's integrated. So it kind of has some attraction, but it has highly flawed. Let's say we look at chromosomes. Well, they kind of try to tell you before you have that, you're not an organism. After that, you are. So it answers a little bit more, makes it a little more persuasive, but it doesn't really tell you much about the continuity, what fundamentally it needs to be an organism, or what integration means. So it's missing some things. If we look at, so then there are certain criteria that look at kind of continuity. If you're philosophically inclined, you might have heard of gen identity, or three-dimensionalism, or four-dimensionalism. They're often used in these debates of when human life begins, but they only focus on continuity, don't really look at these other pieces so much. So that's their problem. What about brain function? A lot of people think, well, it's brain function. Well, we know when we have a brain of a certain level, we're an organism, so it answers this organism after question. And also, the brain is the integrator of our body as an adult, so it answers some stuff about integration too. So this is what makes it so attractive, but you can kind of see it's missing other pieces. Some of you might have heard of the criteria of marine conduct. I wish I could just go over that too. This marine conduct, I'm the biggest fan, by the way. Until I published my paper, I think her paper is the best one that there is on this. All right, I just think she's amazing, and if she hadn't written her papers, I wouldn't have been able to put this together. But her criteria answers things about whether you have an organism before and after, doesn't really handle continuity, does touch on integration, but not whether there's integration at a higher level. So that's one of the reasons why when I first saw her criteria, I thought, wow, it's amazing, this is it, until I started seeing continuity problems. Now, let's say that my criteria is correct. How would we apply this to figure out when human life begins? Well, it depends on what you're actually looking at, clones or what not. Let's look at the basic case of fertilization. All right, sperm plus egg comes together to make the zygote. How does this apply? Okay, so let's ask these questions. Is the sperm, let's start with the sperm, and the answer is the same, we get the same answers for an egg. Is the sperm integrated at this level? Well, in order to answer that, we have to answer, does it have interdependent parts? Yes, there are all these different parts of the sperm working together for the same goals. Are the parts of the sperm subordinate to the sperm? Do they have any goals that are different than the sperm? No, it doesn't have any goals that are different than the sperm. So yes, they're subordinate to the whole sperm. So the sperm is integrated at the level of the sperm. Now we can ask, is the sperm integrated at a higher level? Well, I think the answer is yes. So if you look at the sperm, in order to achieve its goals, it's interdependent with the reproductive system that it came from. So I think it's interdependent. Now, is it subordinate to the reproductive system? Well, does the sperm have any goals that are different than the reproductive system that it came from? I don't think it does, all right? So I think a sperm is completely subordinate to the reproductive system. So that would suggest a sperm is integrated at a higher level, and it's integrated at this level. So if you follow this, integrated at this level, yes. Integrated at a higher level, yes. So therefore, it can't be an organism. You could do the same thing with the egg. So sperm and egg are not organisms. Now what about the zygote? All right, the zygote, I think, is an organism, though. Why? So we ask, is it integrated at this level? Well, does the zygote, the first cell, have interdependent parts? Yes. Are those parts subordinate to the whole? Yes. They follow the goals of the zygote. So yes, the zygote is integrated at its own level. Now, is the zygote integrated at any higher level? And I think the answer is no. All right, maybe you could make a case that it's interdependent with something, but the zygote has goals that are different than the goals of anything else. All right, the zygote, for instance, has different goals than the sperm. Sperm is trying to fertilize an oocyte. Zygote never tries to fertilize an oocyte. All right, the zygote has different goals than any particular oocyte. So oocytes are trying to make themselves available to fertilization. Zygote tries to stop that from happening. All right, the zygote has different goals than the mother. All right, there can potentially be a conflict there. So no, it doesn't have anything that it's subordinate to. So zygote is its own organism. All right, so if you put all that together, and if I'm right, that would mean that before fertilization, you don't have an organism. After fertilization, you do have an organism. And no, before fertilization, you don't have. Afterwards, you do. So therefore, fertilization must create a new organism. You could apply the same thing to cloning. You could apply this to cities. You could apply this to dance crews. You could apply this to silver salamanders. And I think it gets the right answer every single time. All right. So that's my criteria. All right. That's what I think. That's what I think might be a better way of looking at this. Hope that was helpful and interesting. Thank you.
How would you then categorize, say, a bee colony as whether it could be considered like a city or even considered in effect to be so organically connected as to be a meta-organism in and of itself? Or
Yeah,
something like, for example, a colony of single of zygote type trees, like the largest organism, what some scientists consider the largest organism on the planet, which is what most people would see as a single clump of trees. It's in Colorado, is it?
Mm-hmm.
There's another one, but a clump of it's a fungus. It's like a meta organization of zygote type creatures.
Yeah. So I think so. What I'd say is this: I think that if we ask, are all of these bees integrated as a complete whole? I think the answer is no. All right. If you ask, are all these trees integrated as a complete whole? I'm not as certain. I think the answer is still probably no. All right. So I feel like that's probably true. Now, if you ask, well, don't they meet this interdependency and subordination? All right. Well, if they do, I think that criteria is probably wrong, and I need a different set of criteria for integration. But I think that maybe it's wrong, maybe it's not. I think that in the cases of bees, I do think that there's an interdependence there with the rest of the colony. I do think, I also think though that each individual bee is not completely subordinate. I think that it coordinates incredibly with the whole. But I actually think that individual bees can and do have different goals than the bee colony as a whole. Now, if I'm wrong, then maybe it is some kind of meta-organism. And I think you could apply the same thing to these trees. So that's how I approach it.
Bees, not only do they have different functions, but the functionality is effectively developed by what the particular bee is fed by the colony, which determines whether the bee becomes a queen, for example, in the case of a female bee, whether it becomes a queen, or whether it's just a infernal worker bee.
Yeah, so
Gathers the food from the
So
colony.
let's say, so would it be possible, here would be an example of, I think that that's not actually, well, so what you said specifically I don't think is a problem in part because we can say that of human beings too, all right? Like what we do is in part dependent on what we eat. For instance, an NFL player has a different diet than I'm going to have, all right? And that's going to help them achieve their particular functionality, whereas my diet's going to help me achieve more of my particular functionality. So I don't think that that particular issue kind of shows that there can't be different goals there, all right? But I think one of the questions that, so I'm not an expert on bees, but one of the questions that I would ask is, let's say we have a bee, all right? And it actually would have the choice to be a worker or, you know, some other type of bee, all right? Would it take that choice? Like does it have any ability whatsoever to make that choice on its own? Or does it only ever make that choice? Like, is it completely determined that the bee's just going to wait and figure out what does the colony need as a whole? All right. If it only ever does that, then maybe there is some kind of meta-organism here. Maybe there is something that makes sense to look at it more as a complete organism. All right. Or maybe just my integration criteria could be similar. All right. So I think that there is perhaps more development here, and I think so. I'm at level 3. What is where I say you need interdependence and complete subordination? You're almost going to level 4 and saying, what exactly is subordination? And what exactly is interdependence? And I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. Like I can just kind of say, no, I don't really think that's complete subordination, but I'm not at a point where I can completely explain what would complete subordination be. But I think individual bees probably can have different goals than the colony as a whole. And if that's true, then they're not completely subordinate to the colony as a whole. Yes?
Two other possibilities occur to me. One would be like a one-world government where the elites have total monitoring capability, finding out what people's goals are, like mind reading or some such technique. Another model, of course, would be the mystical body of Christ. We're not there, totally because we don't all have the same goals, right?
Yes, yes.
But that's like a theoretical ideal.
Yeah. So the mystical body of Christ. So there are actually a couple things that I would suggest here. So you could even bring things like marriage into this. So in marriage, one of the goals is actually to make two people completely work together and have these shared and a common full goal. All right. Do they ever do that? No. But I think the closer that they get to that, the closer they actually get to acting like one organism. Like when a male and female come together in the conjugal union, what do they call that? They call that the one flesh union. Because the first time, like you asked this question, of all your different systems, how many do you have? How many digestive systems do you have? 1. How many respiratory systems do you have? 1. How many reproductive systems do you have? Less than 1. Less than 1. You don't have a complete one unless it's in the context of someone else's. So like there is some, I think that there's actually some truth to be said that, say when a couple comes together in conjugal union, there's actually this one flesh union. They're actually almost acting like an organism to some extent there. All right, as much, and then the more that a couple shares their goals, the more that the church shares its goals, the more that it acts as if it's one organism. Now there are some other issues here. Like I think that this criteria applies to things that are material. Things like angels, I don't think are organisms, so I don't think that I can apply this to angels very well. And then when you come into something like the mystical union of the church, there's a lot of immateriality there that I don't know whether it really strictly applies here.
Well, no, it doesn't, but that's because we're human and we have flaws.
Yeah.
We don't all agree on what's
But even if we did, but I think that, yeah, if we all completely said, we all not only said, but like all the way down to the core, we're kind of completely united exactly, all right, toward a higher level goal, all right. I think, effectively we would be one organism. I think that at least we'd be getting closer to that. Perhaps there's one other set of criteria that I need to kind of distinguish something like that. Now, if it was a one world government, I mean, That would be hard to see that ever fitting this criteria, because all you would need was you would need one person who had a goal that there not be a one world government.
Right, and that's why
And then even if they could read our minds and fulfill all our goals, well, they can't fulfill that goal.
Right, so more mechanism is required to make that.
Yeah, so I think that you need now if it was kind of now if all of the people, but then you'd actually have this higher thing fulfilling the goals of all these smaller things, as opposed to these smaller things kind of fulfilling the goals of the complete whole, which I think is a little bit different. It's almost like the complete inverse of an organism, I suppose. At least that's what my criteria would suggest.
Yeah, it's kind of like the elites at the top are the brains and the serfs at the bottom are wrong.
Yeah, so I think that you could conceive of things in which that might make sense, but yeah, I mean, and at least in any real scenario, I don't think that.
In reality, it doesn't work.
I don't think it fits.
Right.
Yes.
So I like this conclusion that fertilization creates an organism, but you had been saying before that it takes 24 hours for this first cell reproduction. So if you had to pick,
so I think it's
those
fusion.
time
I think fusion is when
Yeah.
is when you have. I think you already have integration at that moment. If you find Marie Kondick's paper, I think she explains that really well.
okay.
It's freely available. It's like, when does human life begin? Condic is her name, and it's one of my favorites ever. So I think it's fusion. I think there could be biological data that makes me change my mind, but I think it's fusion.